What's going on, you guys? My name is Don't Panic 494, and today we're playing a little Kerbal space program in honor of the 0.21 version being released this week. I decided to start a new save game file, just kind of get a clean slate. I had like 500 super crappy rockets in my other save game file anyways. So it's good to kind of start fresh every once in a while, kind of get a new look on everything. You take all your experience from all your past failures and you build much better rockets. As you can see, this thing is tiny. And it goes all the way to Minmus and back with fuel left over, so it's perfect for going to either the moons of Kerbin, but you're really not going to want to take it much farther than that. Getting back to our flight here, we have achieved stable orbit around Kerbin, so our next step is going to be to burn and create an intercept path for Minmus. Now, I don't really want to do a tutorial on this right now, but essentially what you're going to want to do is try to intercept Minmus about 90 degrees ahead of where it currently is in the orbit. And what you're going to want to do is burn using a maneuver node and manipulate all of those vectors on the node until you hit a path. So I led a little bit past 90 degrees because I'm shooting for a very inefficient intercept path. And as a result, I know I'm going to have to manipulate the inclination of my orbit a little bit, so I know there's going to be a little bit more wiggle room there. And another thing to remember is you don't need it to be exact at this point. You just need to know that you're close, because you can make correction burns along the way as long as you have fuel, and that's what I do here. But unlike my first test flight with this ship, I actually run out of fuel on my way to Minmus on this particular stage. So the first time I flew, I made it all the way into orbit of Minmus on this stage right here, but I took a much more efficient intercept path. So I debated for a second whether or not to just start over and get a better path, and I decided against it because I had so much fuel left over last time. And sure enough, it works out just fine. This lander has a lot of fuel for, how much weight it actually has to push around. So it has plenty of fuel to get me to Minmus, into orbit, and land it, take it back off, and get all the way back to Kerbin with a lot of room to spare. Now that our initial intercept burn is complete, I'm going to extend the solar panels of this lander, which are essentially is just going to act as the power source for the command module. The command module does need a little bit of power generation so that it can continue to maneuver. So obviously that's important, especially if you're going to be landing somewhere. Burning your engines does generate power, but in my opinion, it never hurts to have a backup, just in case. As you can see, we're doing a couple final course corrections to get us in the proper position around Minmus to land. And again, like, this particular video is not meant as a tutorial, so I don't want to get into the specifics of how I did everything, but essentially what you're going to want to do is drop maneuver nodes on your path and just manipulate the vectors until you get the path that you're looking for. It's as simple as that. The best way to learn how all of these different maneuver nodes and all of the different vectors operate is just to experiment. You really, you can look it up, you can watch my videos, you can watch other people's videos, but at the end of the day, you really need to experiment with it to actually feel the results of everything that you're doing before you kind of get a grasp of what's going on. A good place to start is to just launch a ship around orbit of Kerbin and just experiment with different orbital maneuvers, and you'll get a feel pretty quickly for how everything operates. So as you can see, we have achieved stable orbit around Minmus, and I'm currently burning for my final approach path. And for Minmus, I usually shoot for my periaps to be roughly 2 kilometers. Anything between 2 and 5 will be fine. But you want to get it as low as possible. Minmus has virtually no gravitational field. It's unbelievably small. So you can orbit the planet incredibly low and never lose altitude. But I shoot for, like I said, my periapsis to be about 2 kilometers. You want to be careful because there are a lot of hills and mountains, and the altimeter that you get on this particular screen is not a radar altimeter, it's above sea level. So once you're below maybe 8 kilometers, you're going to want to make sure you're on this view and you're going nice and slow and you can see the ground, just to make sure you don't accidentally slam into a mountain, because that would end your flight very abruptly. Right now, I've gone ahead and I have toggled my artificial horizon to surface mode instead of orbit mode, and I'm making small burns on the retrograde vector to just kind of slow down my ground speed. You want your ground speed to be as low as possible, obviously, so that you come straight down when you land. The easiest way for me to achieve that is to use your retrograde vector there as a target. So right now I'm burning straight into that retrograde vector to slow me down, but as soon as it gets to about the 45 degree marker, I'm going to stop and I'm going to just burn on that 45-degree marker until the retrograde vector is pointing straight up. So essentially what that means is that your path opposite of where you're going is directly up, so therefore you're going directly down. I don't know if there's an easier way to do it than that, but that's how I do it, and it's worked every single time. I have yet to crash a single lander on any body I've tried to land on. So as you can see right here, I'm still making burns. I'm locked at the 45-degree angle, and my retrograde vector is still going up. Got to make little corrections here just so you can see the vector, but as long as you're staying below the vector like this, you're not pointing right at it, it's going to move up, up, up slowly. So keep doing really small corrections. The key to landing, at least my philosophy, is to make very small corrections and make as many as you have to. As soon as you start doing big burns and powerful corrections, it just opens up the room for error to so many more things. So as you can see right now, we're going basically straight down, and I'm slowly tapping on the brakes as we go. A little bit of movement isn't going to kill you. As you can see, I kind of slide a little bit. My vector's not perfect, but this lander's really light. Just try not to hit the ground super hard and be ready to take off if you have to. But as soon as you're comfortable, kill the engines, let it bounce a little bit, and she'll settle down. And we have arrived safely on Minmus. And I like to call this particular journey thus far, this is the beginner's journey to Minmus, because we took a really inefficient intercept path because, you know, I never corrected my orbit around Kerbin. I didn't wait for Minmus to be at the optimal spot. I just burned for it right off the bat. I used way more fuel than I had to, came in at a weird angle, but we still made it work. Also, I just took the very first orbit I got around Minmus to use as my landing trajectory, which ended up putting me on this hill here. So that's what I'm saying, like, you don't need to make all of these perfect corrections and make everything completely optimal in order to have a successful landing, as long as you know how to fly at least decently. The very first thing you do after you land obviously has to be screw around in your jetpack for a while, but once the dust settles, you definitely need to plant a flag to commemorate your journey. How else are you going to remember it in the future? So, if I cannot type it in serial killer writing, I'd like to plant this as a YouTube memorial landing site. Thank you, thank you. No, please continue. One last thing you have to do before you leave is read your plaque so you can take a screenshot, because there's no point in having a plaque unless you have a screenshot of it. When you're ready to fly home, keep in mind that the gravity on Minmus is so low it takes virtually no thrust to get you up into orbit. So you're just going to want to tap the thrusters as light as possible and be sure to waste no fuel. This is the part where you need all of your fuel and you need to make sure that you have enough to get back to Kerbin. So if you end up jerking around a little bit here, you may come up just shy of re-entry, which would be pretty crummy. So when I take off, I'm essentially going to tilt myself towards Kerbin. I'm in like the northern hemisphere of this moon, so I'm going to take off and pitch myself in a southerly direction. And basically what I do is I just gain a little bit of altitude and then I create a maneuver node, and I just use that node to point towards Kerbin. So I make the apoapsis point towards Kerbin. And eventually what's going to happen, as you can see, is you're going to escape Minmus and Kerbin's just going to catch you. Because Kerbin has an incredibly strong gravitational pull in relation to both Moon and Minmus. And you're going to want to use the smallest amount of fuel possible in these maneuvers, because when you get into orbit around Kerbin again, you're going to be orbiting at like 50 million meters or something absurd like that. So you're going to need to do another very large burn in order to shrink that altitude so that you actually can put yourself on a re-entry path. So what I do, as you can see, is I stop my burn before it would normally be complete, and then I switch to map mode, and then I use the map to finish it. And essentially the goal is to just get into Kerbin's orbit with the smallest amount of fuel possible. Once you've achieved orbit around Kerbin again, as you can see here, this is where you have to make your decision, because if you have no fuel, or well, not no fuel, but if you have very little fuel, you're going to want to make sure that every burn you make from here on out is as efficient as possible. I have tons of fuel, so I'm just going to burn retrograde right off the bat and just shrink that orbit down. I have so much fuel, in fact, that I'm not even going to use this burn to get me on a re-entry course. I'm going to do that at the periapsis once I reach it. So I'm going to do 2 burns instead of something that, I could have done in just 1 burn, just because I have so much fuel left over still. If I didn't have this much extra fuel, I probably would have waited until my ship was at the apoapsis of Kerbin at like 50,000, 50 million meters or whatever it was. And I would burn retrograde there, and I would just keep burning until I was on a re-entry path. So essentially you're just using all of your fuel at the highest point of the orbit so that you're doing nothing but shrinking the lowest point of the orbit and hoping that you can get that low enough so that the atmosphere is going to catch you. I think the altitude that you're essentially going to at least eventually re-enter the atmosphere is 60 kilometers. So if you can get it down to 35, that's ideal because that's going to guarantee the atmosphere catches you on the first pass. But if you can get it under 60 kilometers, then eventually you're going to lose altitude. I don't know how many rotations it would take. Probably depends on how fast you're going. But eventually you're going to re-enter the atmosphere. So your people will live, which is a good thing. So we've got one more burn to go until our Kerbals will be safely on the ground again, and all we're doing is essentially just creating that re-entry path. So the most efficient way to do it would be to burn at the apoapsis, but I'm burning at the periapsis because I have like 3/4 of a tank of fuel to burn through, so I might as well get rid of it while it's up here. Once you're on that last re-entry path, you really don't have that much more work to do. You just have to decouple the last stage. You should do that as early as possible just so that there's a lot of separation, or the maximum separation, between your command module and the tank and engine. The last thing you want to do is decouple at the last second and then have your command module slam into the tank when it re-enters. That has happened to me. My Kerbals were fine, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Decouple as early as possible. And then the last thing you have to do is just keep your nose pointed at the retrograde vector so that your heat shield hits the atmosphere first, and you're good to go. Once you hit about 35 kilometers or so, you can let go of all the controls because the atmosphere is going to essentially keep your heat shield pointed in the right spot. And it's easy peasy from there on out, as long as you don't forget to open your parachute. As we safely re-enter the atmosphere and slowly approach the beautiful oceans of Kerbin, I want to thank you guys very much for watching the video. As always, I appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day and spending them with me. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see all of you next time. Take care, everybody.